So as Vivian already started to say, the book that I wrote and that came out from my intervention also in the Heidegger debate presents itself as what I call a critique of anti-Semitism. That's the operation. That's the project. Critique of Anti-Anti-Semitism. And when you say something like this, of course, you need to be very careful and to make clear, which I am now doing, that by criticizing anti-Semitism, I do not intend to advocate anti-Semitism. That's not my point. Okay, I'm not criticizing the very idea of opposing and fighting and struggling against anti-Semitism. What I'm trying to do is an internal critique of the project of anti-Semitism. So an internal critique of the attempt to, mostly on the level of theory, on the level of the concept, to develop discursive and intellectual strategies that go against anti-Semitism. So I joined the project of anti-Anti-Semitism. What I am doing is I'm criticizing what I find to be very dominant strategies that have been developed, as a matter of fact, to theorize, so to speak, against anti-Semitism. So it's critique of, when I say a critique of anti-Semitism, when I say anti-Semitism, I don't mean any attempt of speaking against anti-Semitism. I'm speaking about against what I think has been the dominant strategies of doing so. Okay, so this is what I criticize. This is what I critique, namely try to critically study and analyze. When I am talking about dominant strategies, I'm historically speaking mostly about post-45 discourse. I'm talking about theories, philosophies, intellectual project that has been undertaken, developed after the Holocaust. So we're talking about a post-Holocaust period. This is the center, let's say, of my book. And I'm talking about some of the major theorists and theories that has been developed since 45, more or less, until 2 years ago, until basically the recent debate around Heidegger's anti-Semitism. That's the span of time that I'm focusing on. And I'm looking at how philosophers, intellectuals try to develop strategies arguing against anti-Semitism in a period of time where anti-Semitism has no longer been a real in a consensus, but rather the consensus has been that anti-Semitism is something that you need to fight against. So I'm criticizing something that has become quite mainstream within intellectual culture after the Holocaust, the critique of anti-Semitism. Now, it is not only an examination, it is a critique also in the sense of criticism that I find a problem in these dominant strategies of anti-Semitism. And it is this problem that the book tries to show in different ways, try to analyze and try to some way also to counter. But I focus mainly on showing a problem. The problem I want to show, to say it very, very quickly, is that there is a certain counterproductive effect of the dominant anti-Semitic discourse. Counterproductive in the sense of that it achieves the opposite of what it seemingly wishes to achieve, namely, whereas it seemingly wishes to counter anti-Semitism, to fend, to speak against, to struggle, to fight the problematic sides of anti-Semitism. Although this is what it wishes, and I think all these theories that I'm talking about sincerely want that. What I try to show that in some ways, in some moments, and sometimes in a very serious way, what this anti-Semitism achieves is the opposite. Namely, in a sense, to some extent, it, instead of fighting, undermining anti-Semitism, it converges with anti-Semitism. In my book, I speak not only about solidarity with anti-Semitism, I also speak about complicity, namely sharing to some extent the same goals of anti-Semitism. And again, not with the attempt to bring about an anti-Semitic project, but precisely the opposite. So I'm talking about a certain paradox, a certain counterproductive effect. So that's the basic thrust of the project of the book. Now, in what follows now, I would like to do basically three things. First of all, I want to, in order to expound a little of what exactly I'm claiming and showing and doing, I want first very quickly just mention another direction of critique against the dominant forms of anti-Semitism that has already become quite known. A certain critique that has been made by various people. I'm just going to mention one of them. A critique that I find interesting, but this is not, and to some extent also important, but this is not my direction. And then after telling you what I'm not doing, quickly, I'm going to tell you what I am doing, tell you more about the critique that I develop. And I'm going to finish by telling you how I'm doing it in the book. And I try to be as least confusing as I can, because the book is has many pages and I don't want to exhaust you. So I'm just going to give you some highlights. And then in the discussion, if you want to ask more, then I'll be happy to say more. So first, a common critique against dominant forms of anti-Semitism, which is not mine, but which I nonetheless find interesting and important. As a representative of this kind of critique, I will take a scholar by the name of Gila Nijar, who is a professor at Columbia University and who has, in different works, developed something that he explicitly called the critique of anti-Semitism. And his critique is focused on a problem, on the problem that the critique, the struggle, the contemporary dominant struggle against anti-Semitism is oblivious, is forgetful of the Muslim. That's the direction, the basic direction of what Nijar and others have been talking about. Very shortly, the argument is that the discourse, the base discourse from which anti-Semitism arises, namely the discourse of Semitism, which has been developed in the 19th, mostly in the 19th century, European science, had two main Semitic figures, the Jew and the Arab, or the Jew and the Muslim. And these two figures featured in this discourse as two arch enemies. The Jew is the internal enemy, and the Muslim is the external enemy. And according to this understanding, the double enemy at the heart of the Semitic discourse is an essential feature of this discourse, and therefore any forgetfulness, any oblivion of the fact that there are two enemies, in a sense, is not equipped enough to deal with this discourse, to understand it, and to neutralize it. So the kind of anti-Semitism that only focuses on anti-Judaism and forgets to talk about anti-Islam, in a sense, forgets one of the main features of the entire problem, and therefore is not sufficiently equipped theoretically to neutralize the problem. And maybe you also recognize echoes of Elad Seitz's insight that anti-Semitism and Orientalism are inherently connected. This is a direction that I think is important in thinking about and critically thinking about anti-Semitism. This is not what I'm doing in the book. This is not my argument. So now I'm going to talk about what is my argument. So I'm not talking about the forgetfulness or the forgetting of the non-Jewish Semite, the Muslim or the Arab. I'm talking about a forgetfulness of the Jewish in anti-Semitism. This is the basic problem that I try to talk about. How anti-Semitism, which naively could be understood as perhaps philo-Semitism, as perhaps pro-Jewish, has a very central element of oblivion, of forgetfulness, of effacement even of Judaism, of the Jewish. Now, there is a certain paradox, or a certain irony, or a certain contradiction, which I try to express in the title of the book. So I don't know if you can see that, but my book is called not just a critique of anti-Antisemitism, it's called Jews Out of the Question. That's the main title of the book, Jews Out of the Question. And of course, this title tries to capture this tension, this paradox that I'm talking about. There is here a pun, a play of words, Jews out of the question, that on the one hand expresses, of course, the positive attempt after the Holocaust to do away, to part, to stop talking about a Jewish question, the Jewish problems, Jews, yeah, Judenfrage, both question and a problem. So to save the Jews from the question, Jews out of the question. Jews no longer should be put in question and treated as a problem. Okay, this is obviously a good thing to want, and as you all know, the notion of Judenfrage, the Jewish problem, has been a central topos of anti-Semitic discourse, and received also a terrible final solution. So this is, of course, the positive side of anti-Antisemitism, to try to surpass, try to do away, try to stop the discourse of the Jewish question. On the other hand, and here is the pun, out of the question, of course, in the English also mean something that you don't talk about, that you think is nothing to discuss. There is no discussion here. It's out of the question. Jews out of the question, in the sense of Jews are put outside the realm in which there are questions, answers, debates, argument, discussions, a realm that you can call the intellectual realm, the realm of knowledge, the realm of thinking, the realm of philosophy. I use in my book a more technical term, that goes back to Foucault. I use the term episteme, the epistemic realm, the realm of knowledge. Okay, I'm trying to be not decide now if it's philosophy, if it's another discipline. So Jews out of the question also means removing Jews from the realm of knowledge. Removing Jews from the realm of knowledge. Or what I call, again, in a little more technical terminology, de-epistemizing the Jew. De-epistemizing the Jew. Removing the element of knowledge from the Jewish. Which is, and this is my point, a more ambiguous and perhaps to a certain extent problematic and even dangerous consequence of anti-anti-Semitic discourse. So on the one hand, stop the Jewish question. On the other hand, Jews are no longer an epistemic being, no longer belong to the realm of knowledge. That's the double edge, the ambivalence that I'm trying to point at in the dominant structures of anti-anti-Semitic discourse. Now, I'm going to tell you what is the basic argument. I just now made a little comment, midrash, on my title, but now I'm going to tell you what is the argument. So the argument that I'm making in the book, whereby Jews are being de-epistemized by anti-Semitism, the argument is that the dominant, again, forms of anti-Semitism criticize anti-Semitism, right? That's the basic idea. Criticize anti-Semitism, not for attributing negative values to Jews. So not so much for being anti-Jewish, but for attributing any value to Jews, attributing any value, principle, any content that precisely is a content of thought, of knowledge, any epistemic content. So anti-Semitism is being condemned, being criticized, being accused not for thinking against Jews, of course also for that, but what I claim the center, the main problem is not that anti-Semitism thinks against Jews, but that anti-Semitism thinks of Jews at all, or that anti-Semitism places Jews, refers to Jews or the Jewish as an epistemic element, as an epistemic thing, as something that carries some kind of a intellectual content, signification. If you want to talk in a more kind of socio-historical way, the problem found with anti-Semitism is that it refers to Jews as what you can call epistemic agents, as a collective that is constituted, is based on some kind of knowledge. To be provocative, a collective based on Torah. So the problem with anti-Semitism, according to anti-anti-Semitism, is that it attaches any kind of meaningful content to Jewish existence. Some kind of meaningful content that can be adopted, advocated, assented to, or being criticized, called into question. So it's not only anti, also pro. This is my basic observation. This is my basic observation. This is the problem that I find in the dominant forms of anti-Semitism after 45. Okay, condemnation of anti-Semitism for even thinking about Jews. Now, I want to quickly mention two consequences of that. Two consequences of this strategy of condemning, of fighting anti-Semitism by removing Jews out of the question, out of the realm of knowledge. The first consequence concerns the perception of what is anti-Semitism. How we understand anti-Semitism, how we study also anti-Semitism. The consequence of the strategy that I just described of anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism is understood to be a phenomenon that basically has nothing. It is based on no knowledge, no real relations to Jewish phenomena. Because there is nothing to know. There is no epistemic content for Judaism. So the attempt to attribute such content is fantastic. It is not realistic. It cannot be realistic. So anti-Semitism is not understood as being really anti-anything in reality, not Semitism and not Judaism. It is not an anti-something, it's anti-Semitism, what I call dehyphenated. And it has been in recent years indeed a real strategy, editorial strategy of taking out the hyphen with this argument. If you will see, there are institutions and magazines that have made the policy of not writing anti-Semitism with a hyphen because it implies that there is a real there is the real something against which anti-Semitism speaks, and we preclude that. So there is a dehyphenation, and I assure you it's a real thing, which means that anti-Semitism itself is understood basically as a psychological condition, not a condition of knowledge, a condition of some kind of a mental individual situation, pathological, of course, some kind of a fantasy mythology. And the study of anti-Semitism is a study of anti-Semites. And the study of anti-Semites that, as a matter of methodology, need to be studied without Jews, in complete absence of Jews. And I can just point out that there is a whole genre of a certain historiography of anti-Semitism that, as a matter of methodology, studies anti-Semitism in disconnection, in explicit disconnection to Jewish phenomena, Jewish communities, Jewish ideas, Jewish rituals, and so forth and so forth. Now, the second consequence is that anti-Semitism, the problem, is identified with the claim of epistemic content to Judaism or to Jewishness. And therefore, the dominant discourse of anti-Semitism leads to identifying any attempt to make claims of Jewish episteme with something that in its essence is equivalent to an anti-Semitic myth. Okay, anti-Semitism is being identified with any claim that there is an epistemic content for Jewish existence. What this means, and here I come to the heart of my critique, what this means is that it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much to see how, accordingly, anti-Semitism indeed lands at some moments in a situation of complicity with anti-Semitism. It doesn't take much to see that. And this complicity, and in my book, I show the precise moments that this kind of solidarity, this kind of convergence, in fact, took place and is still taking place. This kind of complicity emerges when the condemnation of anti-Semitism for conceptualization of Jewish existence veers into a condemnation of any conceptualization of Jewish existence, which means a condemnation of Judaism, of the claim that there is something like Judaism, namely some kind of a epistemic content that constitute Jewish existence, collective Jewish existence through history. In other words, anti-Semitism readily arrives at a position that is hostile to claims that there is something like a Jewish episteme, Jewish thought, Jewish philosophy. And this means that anti-Semitism readily becomes anti-Judaism. And this is the moment where I identify precisely this counterproductive effect that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, where anti-Semitism, instead of being the opposite of anti-Semitism, becomes something similar to anti-Semitism, precisely as anti-Judaism. Now, I can be even more provocative and say that there is here not only a convergence or similarity or complicity. To some extent, there is here even an amplification and enhancement of the anti-Judaism. There is an even stronger position of antagonism toward Judaism in the anti-Semitic position compared to the anti-Semitic position. If the anti-Semitic position criticizes what it understands as being Jewish knowledge, or being Jewish values, or Jewish philosophy, anti-Semitism completely denies the existence of Jewish episteme, which is epistemically a stronger negation. There is here a stronger negation. So in a sense, there is here even not only convergence, but a real counter effect of making the situation worse. Now, in the last years, maybe some of you have caught that a new concept has become present in the intellectual discourse, the concept of epistemicide. I don't know if you heard about it. It has been used, I think, mostly with respect to the epistemologies of the global South. So how colonial practices led to the eradication of cultures of knowledge, epistemicide. So I claim that there is a tendency of epistemicide in these dominant strategies of anti-Semitism. Yeah, epistemicide in the sense of the murder of knowledge, not homicide, the murder of people, or genocide, the murder of races, peoples, but epistemicide, the murder, the killing of knowledge. So I'm saying there is in this anti-Semitic denial, rejection of Jewish episteme, and epistemicidal tendencies that I'm pointing it, that I want to show. I want now to say something about the positive side, not in the sense of a good, happy side, but I was talking now about what anti-Semitism denies, what kind of absence it asserts, it generates, what kind of oblivion it produces. I want to say something about the kind of presence that anti-Semitic discourse generates. It's not only about denying the existence of something, it's also about positing something, positive in the literal sense of positing something. Obviously, and I began my whole talk by saying this, anti-Semitism wants itself to be a pro-Jewish operation, something that goes against hostility against Jews, against persecution, against anti-Semitism. So it's about taking Jews out of the question, not out of the world. So there is, of course, here a pro-Jewish attempt, or pro-Jewish movement, pro-Jewish tendency. And indeed, the second half of my claim is that anti-Semitism does not only deny, but also assert something, assert a certain form of Jewishness, asserts a certain form of Jewish existence, posits something. What it posits is a Jewishness, Jewish existence that is based on a de-epistemicized collective existence. So denying epistemic value of Jewish existence does not cancel Jewish existence. It produces, it generates, it posits a Jewish existence that is characterized by having no knowledge. Jews without Torah, to be again, play a little now with Jewish knowledge. Now, what kind of a collective is that is characterized by the lack of knowledge? I'm not going to develop now, but I'm just going to say that I think it is connected, again, to invoke some contemporary philosophical discourse. It connected to something that Agamben was conceptualizing under the idea of bare life. So the Jews without knowledge are very often called the living Jews, the Jews flesh and blood, in contradistinction to the Jews, namely, that mean something. We can talk about here about biopolitics, so a political collective based on life, on bio, and not on episteme. So I talk about biopolitics vis-a-vis epistemopolitics. But this is just a few indications for maybe a larger conceptual framework. I also would like to make the comment that the production of this kind of a biopolitical collective, which means the absence of the epistemopolitical collective, is not only produced by anti-Semitism. I think there are different operations in contemporary discourse that contribute to generating biopolitical collectives, and also within, with respect to Judaism or to Jewishness, there are other institutions, other discourses, other dispositif that contribute to this kind of phenomenon, to the creation of Judaism or Jews as a collective without knowledge. You may say that there are some inner performances of Jewishness that go in the same direction, but that's just a comment. This is not what I'm talking in the book. In the book, I'm focusing on anti-Semitism, and what I'm talking about, it's the positive effect of that. Now, this idea of the positing of the collective that has no knowledge, this is in a sense where my book connects to more general discussions of political philosophy of the present, and I'm talking about the phenomena of the negative political epistemology. So a negative phenomena of connecting collectives and knowledge, or more specifically, a certain contemporary tendency that I think exists of dissociating between political collectives and knowledge, which I think this de-epistemicized figure of Judaism created through anti-Semitism is a paradigm, especially after the Holocaust. But that's just, if you wish, the most basic kind of conceptual argument that I'm making in the book. Okay, so far I try to give you the basic critique and the different aspects of this critique. And now, in the time left for me, I'm very quickly, as I promised, I'm going to tell you how I'm showing this in the book, or where I see that in the book. And the book is basically a very long demonstration of what I was just talking about. Demonstration of what I was telling you, a demonstration of different ways in which what I was talking about, in fact, has been theorized, has been written by different philosophers. So I cannot now unfold the entire demonstration. I'm just gonna give you the different main, let's say, main scenes, main stages where my demonstration takes place. So as I said, I'm talking about post-Holocaust post-World War II philosophy and theory. I began the book and the work on the book, as I said, with Heidegger in the recent debate around Heidegger's anti-Semitism. As some of you know, around 2013 to 2014, the famous black notebooks of Heidegger were published, where for the first time everybody could read Heidegger writing very negative things against Jews and Judaism during the Holocaust, during the 40s, and that sparked a big debate. And going into this debate, what became interesting to me is less what Heidegger was saying, which is not so much and not so original, but more how it was debated, how Heidegger's anti-Semitism was debated by philosophers. And what I discovered is, what I observed is more or less what I just told you, that the problem was less about the negativity of Heidegger against Jews and Judaism. The problem was more about how can Heidegger at all bring something like Jews and Judaism into a philosophical text. That was the gist, so to speak, of the shock of the philosophers. So this kind of got me started. In this debate, I found all the different forms of anti-Semitism that I would later discover in other and earlier writers. And then I looked at theorists, as philosophers and intellectuals who developed meaningful interpretations and counter theories to anti-Semitism, from Adorno and Horkheimer to Jean-Paul Sartre to Hannah Arendt, and more recently Alain Badiou and Jean-Luc Nancy, the late Jean-Luc Nancy. The investigation that I propose, the readings, it's mostly readings that I propose in the book, are chronological. They do start from the most earlier ones, right, in 45 or even 44, to the most recent one, but they're not historical. I'm not trying to develop an entire contextualized picture. What I try to show is a certain typology, a certain dialectics of what I call anti-anti-Semitism, anti-anti-Semitic speech. I'm not saying that each one of these persons that I just noticed is a perfect representative of anti-anti-Semitism, or that this is the only thing that they did. In all of these cases, I show how they also developed other directions of thought, but I use them because at some moments in their work, they did present a very articulate form of anti-anti-Semitism that I use. So I use them in order to show the dialectics of anti-anti-Semitism, and not in order to accuse these people. So very quickly, I show that there are three basic positions that I will just say quickly and then stop. The fundamental position of anti-anti-Semitism that I'm talking about is a position whereby the Jewish, in the sense of a Jewish episteme, some kind of epistemic content of Judaism, is an invention of the anti-Semitic mind. I already basically mentioned this position. It's the basic position. Judaism is a creation of anti-Semitism. Or if you wish, the other way around, anti-Semitism is the invention of Judaism. Anti-Semitism is the invention of Judaism, namely the invention of a positive political epistemology, the invention of a collective that is defined by a certain idea. Now, the weaker version of this argument is developed by Adorno and Horkheimer in the Dialectics of Enlightenment. And according to them, this invention is imaginary. the anti-Semite invents in their head a certain Judaism. But there is a stronger version of this argument that was presented famously by Jean-Paul Sartre in the Réflexions sur la question juive, whereby the invention is not only imaginary, but the anti-Semites, in fact, the anti-Semitic fantasy, through a complex interpersonal interaction, in fact, generates a Jewish consciousness. So there is a real invention of Jews through anti-Semitism. It's a real creation. So that's the weak and the strong argument. Of course, I don't deny that there are projections and there are fantasies and there are also real effects, social effects to that, especially among what they call assimilated or non-Jewish Jews. I mean, the Jews that Sartre had in mind when he wrote were precisely people who, so to speak, were reminded that they are Jews and therefore developed Jewish consciousness by encountering hostility from anti-Semites. So I don't say that it doesn't exist. The problem is to suggest that this is Judaism, that this is the paradigm of Judaism. And I think this is the problem, namely that real Jews are de-epistemicized Jews. The second position, that was the first position, that Judaism is the creation of anti-Semitism. The second position that I talk about in the book is the opposite one, is a position whereby anti-Semitism is a creation of Judaism. So there is a Jewish creation of anti-Semitism. According to this position, anti-Semitism does not speak about a fantasy of Judaism, but relates to a real Jewish episteme. There is a Jewish episteme to which anti-Semitism reacts. However, this Jewish episteme is in its essence anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic how? It is a racist episteme, because it is it's an episteme, it's a knowledge, it's a culture that attributes knowledge or episteme or thought to peoples. So the problem begins with Judaism. And so anti-Semitism, according to this position, is a reproduction of Judaism. It reproduces the problem that is originally Jewish. Now, there are two thinkers that I think stand for this position. One of them is Hannah Arendt, again, in a certain moment of her, I don't think it's the only thing that she said, but at a certain moment in the origins of totalitarianism, she develops a certain genealogy of racism and anti-Semitism that leads back to Judaism. And the second thinker, a more recent one, is Alain Badiou, in his book on the use of the word Jew and the book on St. Paul, where he precisely presents Jewishness or Judaism as a real historical paradigm of ethnic particularism that is reproduced by anti-Semitism and, of course, negated and surpassed by Christianity. The third position, which is the last one for now, and I think it is the last position that marks also the limits of the anti-Semitic discourse, is a position according to which anti-Semitism, again, relates to a real Jewish episteme, a real historical Jewish knowledge. But it is not simply a Judaism that is the source of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism does not reproduce Judaism. Anti-Semitism opposes Judaism. Anti-Semitism is the opposite of Judaism, which could have been trivial. Anti-Semitism is anti-Judaism. But as I showed you, it's not at all trivial. So according to this position, anti-Semitism really opposes a real Judaism, a real body tradition of knowledge. It's actually anti-Jewish. Why do I say that this position is still anti-Semitic, if it does acknowledge that there is a Jewish episteme which is not simply anti-Semitic? Because according to this position, this Jewish episteme, the real Jewish episteme in history that anti-Semitism is the opposite of, is in its essence something very, very similar to anti-Anti-Semitism. It is a paradoxical figure of a collective whose knowledge is that there is no connection between collectives and knowledge. So it's a Judaism that in its essence negates Jewish knowledge. It is, of course, a very paradoxical, self-contradictory figure, an interesting figure that I think at some moments has also positive and interesting elements, but has also an anti-Semitic mode. And I think the representative of this position is the late Jean-Luc Nancy, who passed away a few months ago. And he developed it in some of his very, very last texts that were precisely written as his intervention on the Heidegger debate. So the banality of Heidegger is one of them. The other one is excluding the Jew within us, where he develops this idea of Judaism based on a principle of alterity, of a self that is based on dispersion of the self, a people of no people. So basically, Judaism that is based on anti-Semitism. That's the last position. I will conclude with that. I will just say, repeat and say that it is this last position which I also find interesting, and at some moments with the potential of going beyond anti-Anti-Semitism and actually lead to a productive discussion of a possible Jewish episteme. Thank you very much for your attention.